Well, it's my pleasure today to introduce a gentleman who's had an influence on a lot of people in this room and a lot of people's children in this room. Uh, I have with us today David Hoover. Uh, I'm introducing David Hoover. You can read about his name on the page there, but David is a lifelong resident of Kingsport. He represents half of the life of Kingsport. He was born here in 1951, which is about halfway to where we are in the development of Kingsport and of the East Tennessee area, all the way from Chattanooga up here. Uh, uh, David graduated from Dobbins Bennett, the new Dobbins Bennett, in 1969. He broke the old Dobbins Bennett out as a freshman, but he worked with the new one. And in 1973, he graduated from where am I here? Or Carson Newman. Yeah, and came to Kingsport as an instructor in the new Dobbins Bennett High School, and has made his life's work in the education here in Kingsport with the experience of 44 years there. That's remarkable. I mean, most of us don't live 44 years, so you've done a great job. He played baseball at Carson Newman, and then he came to Dobbins Bennett. He coached baseball at Dobbins Bennett as well, so he made good moves in that direction. It's part of that experience. In 1995, he was voted social studies teacher of the year in the state of Tennessee, which is certainly something to be proud of, because history, which is his area, is widely taught in the school system across our great state. He coached baseball for 24 years here, and in the more recent times, he's become an author. And he has written 3 books. Number one is a book on the story of the people who started athletics in Dobbins Bennett, and that was I'm trying to think of his name. I was out of school before he died, but the name of the book was explaining how the Dobbins Bennett was getting itself started with athletics, with Dr. Sprinkle as being the fellow who did that. He did that up until about 1934, and after that, our speaker wrote a book, and it was the history of Dobbins Bennett football from 1921 to 2021. That's 100 years. 100 years. That's a little bit longer than, less than Kingsport, but a little bit longer than most of us here. So anyway, and after that, he moved on and has written another book on the history of Dobbins Bennett football itself. And now he's very close to issuing a new book on the history of Dobbins Bennett basketball. So I know a number of people in here are big fans of athletics at Dobbins Bennett. I look around, I can name a bunch of you. So you're going to be able to get all the details of another aspect of Dobbins Bennett in its 100+ years. So I hope you'll welcome our friend David Hunter, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the people who helped bring 250 years of history to our kids. Hold that right over your nose. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Excuse me. Several years ago, I spoke here about my book on the history of DB football, and I looked out, and there were a student or two that I'd actually taught at that time, and kind of made me lead to this today. If there are any former students here today, and I can't tell right off just looking out, but you could have a 5-question quiz at the end of this talk. And I'd always say that to them, especially in the early days when I showed film strips. Now, film strips didn't put you to sleep, nothing would, but that was kind of a warning. And later on, we got more modern with videos and so forth. But anyway, I congratulate the Kiwanis Club for the attention you're giving to the 250-year history of this country. You know, as a historian, the two greatest civilizations, two greatest countries, if you want to call the Roman Empire a country, would be the United States of America and the Roman Empire. And, one thing that I always told my students, and of course, American history was a required subject. So on the first day, I would always tell them that the importance of American history is if you know the past, you can better handle the present, and you can better deal with the future. If we're going to survive as a democracy, if we're going to be successful, our people who vote need to be educated. And that's why I hope American history is never taken out of the curriculum. I hope civics is a required course because it's so important for people to know issues and know our history, because history does repeat itself time after time. And if you know what's happened in the past, then it makes it easier to know who to vote for example, and what your position is. And I might say, too, even though I know the political scene can get a little bit carried away with accusations that people make, and it can get bitter, the competition for ideas helps make us stronger because it makes you think. I know a lot of you probably been involved in business. You know, the competition you feel in the free enterprise system makes you work harder, makes you think harder. And the same thing goes when it comes to politics. You need to hear both sides of the issues. You need to study it. You need to know it. Tennessee is the home of some prominent Americans who have made a difference. And there are 3 people I want to talk about today. The first one's probably the most famous Tennessean in history, and that would be Andrew Jackson. First of all, I can say, anytime a president takes office, he's asked, is there some former president whose portrait you want hung in the Oval Office? When they asked Donald Trump, when he first was elected, whose portrait do you want hung up? He immediately said, Andrew Jackson. And there are a lot of similarities between Jackson and Trump. And it kind of gave me the feeling as I go over some of this, Trump must have read a book about Andrew Jackson, when it came to some of the policies that he's established. Jackson was a true rags to riches president. He started off tough. Every president before him, if they didn't come from the aristocracy, they were fairly well educated, very knowledgeable. Money was not an issue. With Andrew Jackson, he never knew his father. His father died in a logging accident several days before he was born. He had 2 brothers. Both of them died in the Revolutionary War. One of them fighting, he actually had a heat stroke, and the other one died of smallpox. During the war, his mother went to Charleston, South Carolina to work in a prison hospital to nurse American prisoners. She got sick with cholera and she died. And from the time Andrew Jackson was 15 years old on, he had no direct family. And there were some relatives nearby that helped take care of him. But I have to say this, he was sort of mad at the world with the way everything had gone with his family. He grew up just south of Charlotte, North Carolina, along the North Carolina-South Carolina border. And I have to say this, he was Scotch-Irish too. Now, if you know anything about Scotch-Irish, some of you might be that way. Don't want to make you mad. The Scotch Irish came from Scotland, Ireland. They were kind of always looked down upon over there. They came to America. They were looked down upon when they came to America. Instead of settling in the eastern cities, they went out into the rural parts of New York, Pennsylvania. A lot of them who weren't real happy there came down to what they called the Big Valley, and they settled in North Carolina, South Carolina, some of them in Western Virginia, and some of them moved eventually to what's now Tennessee. Well, Jackson was one of those. He was Scotch Irish. He had a bad temper. He's mad at the world. I don't know if I'll tell this story, but when he was 13 years old, he somehow got caught up in the fighting in the Revolution. And he got thrown into this cabin where there were some British officers. And Jackson was hollering and screaming and saying a lot of things he shouldn't have been saying. And this British officer finally grabbed a hold of him. He said, "I want you to shine my boots." Well, Jackson told him he would not shine those boots. And he threw in a bunch of words that most 13-year-olds didn't know. But anyway, the officer pulled out his sword and slashed Jackson right across his cheek. It left a scar on his face that would stay there the rest of his life. And the story goes that when he was president, he used to do stuff just to irritate the British because he did hold grudges, and he never forgot that. He eventually, as a young man, moved to Jonesboro, nearby here. He was a prosecutor. He would hunt down the bad guys. He eventually then moved to Nashville, the Nashville area. He became friends with the Donaldson family that was very prominent there. And he became a lawyer, a farmer. He was elected as the first congressman from the state of Tennessee. He was elected to the Senate. And the point of all that was he had natural leadership ability. And he was involved in politics from the get-go, you might say. Of course, the one most notable event perhaps in his early adult career came on May 30th, 1806, when he fought a duel with a man named Charles Dickinson. Now, the favorite sport in Tennessee in the early 1800s was horse racing. And prominent Middle Tennesseans had horses that they would race and they would bet large amounts of money on. Well, they have this big race. Jackson's horse comes from behind and he wins. And all these men come up to him, giving him money. And he's about as happy as he can be. And there's this one man that Jackson didn't know, a guy by the name of Charles Dickinson, who came up to Jackson mad because his horse lost. He gave him some money and he insulted Jackson's wife, Rachel. Now, the story behind that, Days of Our Lives couldn't have come up with a better story than all this right here. Jackson, when he moved in with the Donaldson family, immediately grew a liking to Rachel Donaldson. Rachel was married to a Kentuckian by the name of Lewis Robards. They didn't get along at all. And Rachel got to where she liked Andrew. Well, to make a long story short, Rachel wanted a divorce. Divorces back then had to be approved by state legislatures. Well, because they got married in Kentucky, Virginia owned Kentucky, so the Virginia state legislature had to approve the divorce. Well, Jackson got word that the divorce papers were in a committee in the Virginia legislature, and it's just a matter of time before it all becomes official. Well, he's madly in love with Rachel, and he talks Rachel into marrying him. Now, being a lawyer, he should have checked all this out, but he was madly in love, and she liked him too. But anyway, so they went ahead and got married in 1791. A few years later, they found out the divorce had not gone through, that the legislature had closed up early, they just kind of ignored it. It just didn't happen. And then, with them being a prominent family, and because Jackson he's one of those guys you either liked or you disliked. I mean, he's Scotch-Irish, anyway. There was a lot of gossip about it. Jackson didn't care. He was tough-minded. People kind of scared of him anyway. But Rachel was very sensitive, and it really bothered her. And Jackson knew that. So when Dickinson said that day, Jackson went nuts. He said, "I tell you what, big boy, you meet me on the field of honor, Now, what Jackson didn't know was Charles Dickinson was known as the best shot in the state of Tennessee. Duels were kind of common in Tennessee back then. Well, they agreed to meet on May 30th, Memorial Day. It's kind of good holiday. ESPN come in and take care of that. But anyway, they decided to go across the state line to Kentucky because Tennessee was getting such a bad reputation for duels. And Jackson was kind of a prominent guy. So Jackson, though, knows he's in trouble. Rachel begged him not to go through with this. Jackson is 6'1", 140 pounds. He's tall and he's thin. So he gets a coat that is way too big for him, and he wears it to the duel. Now, for the duel, they're facing each other about 8 yards apart. You got a little referee over here on the side. And when the command is given to fire, they both of them raise their pistols. Dickinson fires first, and he hits Jackson right in the chest. I don't know if you've ever been shot in the chest, but it hurts real bad. And Jackson's grabbing his chest, and oh my gosh, blood coming out. Dickinson's looking at him, well, go down, go down. But Jackson kept his feet. And in the meantime, it suddenly occurred to Dickinson, Jackson's not fired his gun. And according to the rules of dueling, each man gets one shot. So Jackson takes his gun, and he's getting ready to fire the gun, and the trigger doesn't work. Well, he has to, hey, I got to fix this trigger. Oh, yeah, Dixon, yeah, go ahead, whatever. So anyway, he fixed his trigger, aimed it, got him, hits Dickinson in the chest, and he collapses and dies. Well, everybody rushes up to Jackson, and they take his coat off, and he's just laying there in tremendous pain. Somebody noticed on the coat that Dickinson's bullet apparently went through the middle button of Jackson's coat. Dickinson was such a good shot, that's what he aimed at, thinking that would be over Jackson's heart. Well, he missed his heart, but he got him in the lung, one of his lungs. That's still not good to get shot in the lungs. But Jackson survived. I have to ask you, how many of you would be willing to fight a duel because somebody said something bad about your wife? Forget that. How many of you would be willing to take a bullet, hoping it didn't kill you, and then kill whoever's trying to kill you or shoot him? I mean, you talk about courage. And when the word got out among the common people in Tennessee and throughout the country, later when he became more famous, everybody just, oh man, that's my kind of guy right there. But Jackson was in bed essentially for about 2 months after that, recovering. But that really enhanced his whole reputation, whether you think it's good, bad, whatever. And of course, he became a hero because he was the commanding general at the Battle of New Orleans. It ended the War of 1812. Actually, the war was over several weeks before, but they didn't know it. The treaty had been signed in Europe. But that made him famous throughout the country. Historians will say Andrew Jackson was the biggest hero in America since George Washington for what he had done. Rags to riches guy, tough guy, and a military hero. I mean, it's hard to top that. So when the presidential election of 1824 comes around, he gets talked into running. He really wasn't all that fired up about it. But, back then you didn't campaign. I mean, he's staying at home waiting for the votes to come in. The problem is there's 4 different people running. And that means the electoral vote was all divided up. To be elected, you have to have a majority of the electoral votes. And he led in the electoral vote and the popular vote, but he didn't have a majority. That threw the election into the House of Representatives. Each state gets 1 vote. And what happened was John Quincy Adams, who was second, got the support of Henry Clay, who, by the way, finished last. Henry Clay of Kentucky. He hated Jackson. Jackson hated him. But anyway, because Clay gave Adams his votes or his support, Adams won the election. Even though he lost the popular vote and trailed in the electoral vote. He was second there. Well, the story goes Jackson wasn't all that tore up about it. He knew, well, that's what the Constitution says. That's just what you got to do. But then comes the announcement that John Quincy Adams chose Henry Clay to be Secretary of State. And all of a sudden, the Jackson people are claiming corrupt bargain. They made some kind of deal. And you got to understand, Secretary of State's the second most powerful job in the country. 3 out of the 4 previous presidents had been Secretary of State first. And Clay wanted to be president bad. So, you know, as you go into the election of 1828, Jackson's all fired up. Yeah, I'm going to get revenge. And I also might say another thing that made Jackson important from a political standpoint, and really from a national standpoint. He, more than anyone else, pushed for the idea that you would eliminate property qualifications in order to vote. Believe it or not, when this country began, in most states, you had to own 50 acres in order to vote. You had to own 100 acres in order to hold office. I mean, it wasn't pure democracy, when we started as a country. But to show you the effect of all that, in 1824, when Adams won that election, 25% of all the eligible voters voted. Not much. 1828, 50% of all eligible voters voted. Property rules were taken away. Jackson responsible for that. People credited Jackson for it, and he didn't have all those other people running for president. Okay, now as far as why Jackson was important as president, he was one of the 2 founders of the Democratic Party. I don't know if Donald Trump knows that, but Thomas Jefferson, the other founder. But it was basically because Jackson supported the common man. And that's one thing Democratic parties had as one of their main beliefs through the years. And Jackson was associated with that. But there are 3 issues that Jackson dealt with where you can draw some comparisons to today. And you ask, well, why is history important? Is it just knowledge of a bunch of facts just to know them? No. It's taking things that happened and seeing how people in power today may take that and say, hey, I like that idea. Let's do that. All right. First thing, he began the spoil system. He rewarded his supporters with government jobs. That had never been done before. In fact, since 1789, when George Washington first became president, only 100 federal office holders in the executive department the president could hire had been fired. Only 100. In Jackson's first year as president, he fired and replaced 900. He went crazy. And some would draw a comparison to Donald Trump, with some of his selections. But the truth was, since then, all presidents have done that. You kind of, it's a little bit political, but you want people you can trust, in the federal government. Secondly, Jackson destroyed the National Bank. Now, the National Bank was a conservative institution, but one criticism of it under Nicholas Biddle, the president, they usually only made loans to people who were pretty well off. And there was criticism of that, from Jackson especially. And he wanted to do away with that. Now, some would draw a comparison to Donald Trump. Right now, he's trying to get the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates so they can, interest rates with banks would go down so you can loan more money to the lower classes. But Jackson really got carried away with this. He removed all the federal government deposits, and that's 20% of all the money in the National Bank, and put that in state banks, pet banks. By the way, Chief Justice John Marshall said you can't do that. It's unconstitutional. Jackson said, I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. Let's see if you're going to do anything about it. The Supreme Court didn't do anything about it. Now, was it a good idea, bad idea? By 1836, the end of his presidency, we were hit with widespread inflation. Too much money had gone out. Maybe you can make the argument, maybe this isn't true. State and local banks, maybe they tend to be a little bit more lenient with loans because they know you better. National Bank, conservative institution, people live far away, they got the rules, yeah, blah, blah. But anyway, it led to a depression in 1837, the Panic of 1837. Third thing Jackson did, he moved the Indians west of the Mississippi River. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to 60,000 Indians being moved, either voluntarily or forced. Some might draw a comparison today to Trump trying to remove 12 million illegal immigrants. Not quite the same thing. The Indians were a little bit, most people would say, more of a threat. Not all of them. And Jackson, who a lot of people said, well, he's just an old Indian fighter, and he had fought against Indians. But he also inherited or took in an Indian orphan after fighting against the Indians in Alabama before the War of 1812. He said the Indians would be better off. They can live in peace. They can hunt buffalo. They can do whatever out in the Great Plains. Of course, you're kind of postponing the problem for 30 or 40 years probably. But, of course, that was something that was definitely different about Jackson. And by the way, one thing I love to do as a teacher was have debates among my students. I love to take issues like these three and say, all right, you people are national Republicans. That's people that didn't like Jackson. You people are Democrats. You people are neutral. Each of you people representing the parties, you've got to come up with 3 arguments why your position's the best. Neutral, you got to come up with 2 or 3 questions for each group. Yeah, blah, blah. And they'd debate the whole thing. And the interesting thing was, the neutral groups, when it came to these 3 issues through the years, usually voted against Jackson. They liked him as a charismatic leader. They liked him being the hero of New Orleans. But they didn't agree with his policy. They did not agree on these 3 issues. But, you know, and that kind of goes back to what I said from the beginning. You know, as a teacher, you got to get students involved. You got to get them thinking. You got to get them talking. You can't just sit there and lecture every day, you know, a bunch of facts. And therefore, you're hoping in the future they'll think more about issues. All right, the other person I want to mention as far as the president, James K. Polk, president from 1844 to 1848, spent most of his adult life in Columbia, Tennessee, south of Nashville. He was a follower of Jackson, and he really got the job because people still liked Jackson. It didn't matter what's going on economically or anything else. But also he supported something called Manifest Destiny, whereby the belief was the United States is destined to expand because we have the best democracy in the history of the world, because we've been so successful to this point. We owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to the people who would be affected to expand. They would be better off. So he wanted to take over the Southwest and the Oregon Territory, which is basically everything west of the Great Plains. And the other part of that belief was God has even destined the United States for greatness, that he holds us in a special light, and therefore it's okay to take over that land. Well, Polk won the election over Henry Clay in 1844, and he immediately took action. In 1845, he offered Mexico $30 million for what's now New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, Wyoming, basically all that area west of the Great Plains except for the Oregon Territory. That would be $125 million today. Well, Mexico rejected it. It was a matter of pride to them. You know, no, I don't care how much money you offer us. That's our land. Well, Polk got mad. By the way, he was Scotch-Irish also. So what he does, in March of 1846, he sends General Zachary Taylor and 1,500 troops into some disputed land in southern Texas between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River. Mexico always thought the boundary was the Nueces River, which is farther to the north and to the east of the Rio Grande. We considered it to be the Rio Grande. All right, well, when we had those troops go in there, the Mexicans got mad, said, you've invaded our country. So they send some troops across the river. There's a skirmish, 16 American casualties. Now, Polk was already talking about trying to go to war, get Congress to go to war. And before this happened, Congress wasn't interested. No, we don't have the reason to do that. But now Polk said, well, American blood has been spilled on American soil. By the way, there was a young congressman from Illinois by the name of Abraham Lincoln. He said, now where exactly did this take place? And are you sure that's American land where this took place? He didn't agree with that at all. But anyway, Congress decided to go ahead and go to war. Well, back then you didn't have a draft. You had volunteers to join the Army. And the one state that stood out more than any other was the state of Tennessee. The governor of the state, Aaron Brown, requested 2,800 volunteers. He got 30,000. That's why Tennessee today is known as the volunteer state. It all started in the War of 1812. We went nuts back then. I don't know if it's because we were brave or dumb, but a lot of Scotch Irish there too. But that's why we became known in that fashion. Well, the result was we won the Mexican War. We got all that land. When the whole thing was over with, maybe we felt a little bit guilty because we gave Mexico $15 million. Kind of reminds me today, and I don't want to get into controversy here, but assuming we've won the Iranian war, now we want to provide them with $300 million for a reconstruction fund. Now, supposedly no American money will be involved, but we'll see what happens. And I don't know if Donald Trump, read a book about James K. Polk, but Manifest Destiny might have had influence on him because he talked about taking over Greenland and taking over Cuba. Now, probably with Cuba, it's more economic concessions, that kind of thing. Those people, they don't want that to happen. But the argument was, well, it'll help us, but, he's making the argument too, it'll help them. They'll be better off. But all that was influenced, events today by what happened way back then, where presidents, advisors, and they have a lot to do with what goes on. They say, well, look, we've done this kind of thing before. Maybe it's okay. Final person I want to mention is a man by the name of Alvin York. Alvin York grew up in Fentress County near the village of Pall Mall, Pallmall. Later had a cigarette named after him. But anyway, he grew up poor as he could be. He was the third child of 11 children, lived on the side of a hill, terrible economic situation, farmers, and so forth. But during this period of time, he grew up in, if you've ever seen the movie Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper, made in 1940, won all kinds of Academy Awards. It's not completely accurate with some things, but it was true about his upbringing. He was a wild child, you might say, in his teenage years and in the 20s. But in 1915, he joined his mother's church, which was a very fundamentalist church. He took the Bible literally. Well, during that time, World War I commences. Well, York gets drafted, but he doesn't believe he should go because it goes against the Bible. The Bible says, thou shalt not kill. Now, understand here, York had practically no education at all. I mean, he didn't understand what was going on in Europe. He didn't understand the issues there, how it affected the United States, unrestricted submarine warfare and all that. But anyway, he applied to be a conscientious objector when the United States entered the war. But because his church was not an officially recognized church, the draft board rejected his request. So he had to go fight. Well, he'd been using a gun to hunt since he was a little kid. Very accurate marksman. Well, on October 8th, 1918, his unit was fighting in eastern France. There were about 20 of them, and they got trapped by about 150 Germans, and they're in bad trouble. Well, York was in charge all of a sudden because his superior had gotten wounded. So he sneaks over to the side, and Germans are in this trench, straight trench. And York's trying to figure out what to do. Now, according to the movie Sergeant York, he cut loose with this turkey yell. Now, I don't really want to do that. Throat's sore anyway. But anyway, gobble, gobble, gobble. And next thing you know, these Germans, first German in the row there, he'd stick his head up, York would kill him. And he went on down the line, killing one after another with this turkey yell. Now, I don't think turkey yell actually happened. But when his fellow soldiers saw what was going on, they sneaked over the other side. They did the same thing. And they're mowing down the Germans. Now, according to the movie, York went back behind, looked for the officer that had the most medals on him, and grabbed him and saying, hey, you're completely surrounded, and you better give up. Well, and I don't know if that's true. But the German officer did think he was surrounded, and he surrendered about 90 troops. On the way back of escorting those troops, they took about 40 or more troops after that they captured. York was credited with killing 20 Germans and capturing 132. When he comes back home, he's a hero. John Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, said that Alvin York was the greatest civilian soldier of the war. Now, before York left to go to Europe, he was in love with a young thing by the name of Gracie. And they talked about getting married, but Alvin always said, I ain't going to marry you until I can get some bottom land. Now, he's poor as dirt. He said, I got to be able to support you. And she'd keep pestering him, but he said, you heard what I said. So he comes back. When he comes back, he's treated as a hero, and all these companies come to him wanting him to endorse their product. A cereal company offered Alvin York $75,000 if he would endorse their product. Now, here's a guy who wanted to raise $150 so he can marry Gracie. Well, York came up with a famous statement with that. He said, quote, this uniform ain't for sale. He declined it. He didn't decline. He came back to Tennessee, and he was greeted as a hero. He finally raised $150 so he could marry Gracie. He was 30, she was 19. But what also happened in 1922, the state of Tennessee provided him with some land where he and Gracie could settle down on. He eventually raised money to establish York Institute, a new school for the underprivileged kids of Fentress County. You know, if you've ever been through that part, it's north of Crossville, near the Kentucky line. A lot of mountain kids that really had no education. And, you know, he really made a contribution to all that. So, you know, you think about all this, York represented a positive perception of Tennesseans by outsiders. You know, sometimes you wonder, what do people on the outside think about Tennesseans? I think, for one thing, they talk about us being part of the Bible Belt, the percentage of Christians. I looked this up. 72% of all people living in Tennessee are Christians. The percentage nationally, 63%. There's a difference there. You know, Alvin York represented that in the way he went about doing things, and that's one reason people were admired. You think about Tennesseans being known for toughness. You think about Andrew Jackson. You think about Alvin York. What they did, that required toughness. And you need some heroes sometimes to rally around. And you talk about military service. Think about how Tennesseans volunteered to the service more than any state in the Union. And that's something to be proud of. That's why we're the volunteer state. And, you know, one thing about York, too, here he was a conscientious objector, but look at the courage that he fought with when he got over there. And, you know, that says something as well. But I appreciate being here, and, you know, we should be very proud of this country. You know, we need to take time sometimes to honor ourselves and look back and why we have the greatest civilization, the greatest country in the world. But we have to fight to keep it that way. And, you know, that's why history is important. You got to know your history. You got to know issues, and you got to make good decisions, because the people, through who they elected, are really in charge. Thank you.